Game controllers are expensive.
I think it was when I first saw the Switch Pro controller that I realized just how pricey these things have become. Though capable pieces of technology they may be, game controllers have gone from being 30, maybe 40 bucks to costing as much as, if not more than new games, which says a lot when game prices are going up too. More often than not, you won't need more than a couple, but maybe you're on a tight budget, or maybe the controller that came with your console doesn't have certain features you want, or maybe you're some dumb broke middle schooler who doesn't know any better. That is where the third-party controller comes in. These are just a fact of life when I was younger. Why spend $30 extra on an OEM controller when you could spend that on a game or snacks or, dear God, anything but taxes? As I've gotten older, I've had a few too many negative experiences with third-party controllers to really be going out of my way to buy them. However, these things have changed a lot over time, and given the wide range of price points and features, some of them do make for tempting alternatives to the factory originals, which makes me wonder, are these things really that bad? Well, that is the question I'm going to be answering today. I've got a big box of third-party controllers here, so let's go through these and see which ones are good and which ones make me regret my life choices. The further back in time you go, the more gimmick-based third-party controllers get. A lot of early game consoles maxed out at 2 controller ports, so if you wanted people to buy your controller, then it really had to be something special, which is how we ended up with things like the Quickshot Warrior joystick for PC. We've got some 35-year-old suction cups on the bottom, slam that bad boy down on your desk, it might not go anywhere. These dials down here do something, maybe, and the buttons up top provide some decently satisfying clicking action, while the stick itself has a pretty solid range of motion. I don't have anything I can test it with, but I imagine that for back in the day, this was a decent enough option to use with flight sim games on your PC. I mean, it sure beats playing Wing Commander on a keyboard. Aside from specialty controllers like that, for much of the 90s, most third-party manufacturers followed the same general formula. Many of them seem content with simply taking an OEM controller, warping some dimensions, maybe throwing in turbo functionality, and calling it a day, which seems simple enough, but more often than not results in a controller that's pretty underwhelming at best, if not outright bad. As a prime example, a PlayStation 1 gamepad made by Blockbuster Video. Am I reading that right? Turbo buttons have been thrown up here for some reason, but other than that, layout-wise, it's pretty close to what the original PlayStation controllers had, aside from the buttons being a bit larger and the controller itself being... This thing looks like it was born inside a house of mirrors. It is comically proportioned. Never mind it feeling cheap, the dimensions alone make this controller straight up distracting to use, which is probably the worst thing a controller could be. However, once we hit the 6th generation back in the late 90s and early aughts, that was when third-party manufacturers really hit their stride in terms of making controllers that were both dirt cheap and weirdly interesting. Naturally, I'd be remiss to start that discussion with anyone other than the most legendary manufacturer of mediocrity out there, the one and only Mad Catz. Serving as our representative, we have the Mad Catz Dual Force controller for PlayStation 2, and this one practically has younger sibling controller written all over it. With translucent blue plastic and contoured rubber grips, this controller is both eye-catching and ergonomic, and while these sticks and buttons aren't the best, they're at least a half step above what you're getting from other third-party manufacturers. It's even got rumble, analog face buttons, and a nice weight to it, just like the DualShock 2. It's a totally usable controller. You just wouldn't be caught dead using it because, come on, you were born first. And that sleek black controller that came with the console, that is your birthright. More along the lines of the Blockbuster gamepad, GameStop used to do a ton of their own branded controllers, and while they don't dabble in it as much anymore, there's still quite a few of these floating around. Here we have a GameStop controller for PS2, and yikes, this is rough. The bumpers are wobbly, the circle pad is awful, the sticks are both too small and way too close together, the plastic is cheap, and based on the weight of it, I'd be surprised if the rumble isn't the worst thing I've ever felt in my life. This makes the Mad Catz controller feel straight up premium by comparison. However, I'd still much rather use this over the Blockbuster gamepad, and even other controllers that came out in this generation. It's pretty ergonomic, and the buttons and sticks otherwise feel pretty solid, so I wouldn't quite consider it to be pure garbage. But what I think says a lot about this generation of third-party controllers is the fact that even the ones that were garbage could still end up being pretty interesting. Here's an in-tech wired controller for the original Xbox, and if you're like me, then the first thing you're wondering upon seeing this thing is, why is Darth Vader here? Apparently, yes, this is an officially licensed controller, which makes it all the more tragic just how pathetic it is. It's got the same proportions as the Duke, but everything here has been shrunk down considerably, so the buttons and sticks all feel a little too close together. Some black and white Tic Tacs have been thrown up here as makeshift bumpers, and they are way too cheap and flimsy to feel satisfying. Button firmness ranges from slightly mushy to way too stiff to somewhat springy, and the rubber grips on the side hit a nice medium of being both odd and tactically distracting. As is, I would hesitate to give this to even player 4. But it does light up though.
Well, that just makes it all worth it.
Here's a Pelican Eclipse 2 wireless controller, also for the original Xbox. The feel is about the same as the Star Wars controller, down to the flimsy makeshift bumpers and awkward grips, but size-wise it's more in line with an OEM controller S, which means it's far more usable than the other. However, it does not light up. A harder choice has never been faced. Now once the 7th generation of home consoles hit, that was when I really started noticing the emerging dichotomy of third-party controllers, how they tend to be either a really good value for the price, or just the worst garbage imaginable. Take for example this GameStop branded Xbox 360 controller. This is the one third-party controller that I've owned longer than any other, as evidenced by the sticks having been completely eviscerated by my sweaty ass thumbs. Aside from a few minor details like the thumbsticks and bumpers feeling a touch lighter than Microsoft's, this is a surprisingly solid option. It's comfortable, well built, and everything else clicks like it should. Not quite on par with OEM, but for the $20-ish I paid for this back in the day, oh yeah, this is a pretty good controller. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, a GameStop controller for GameCube. Let's get the pros out of the way first. Number 1, it's wireless. Now for the cons. What in the hell is this shrunken, grotesque husk of a controller? Why is the left stick made of hard plastic? Why does the right stick feel more appropriately sized for my pinky than my thumb? Who picked this font for the buttons? Why is the whole controller so tiny? Ribbed rubber grips. Yeah, that sure won't be distracting. This is just an awkward mashup of various crappy ideas all bundled into one all too undersized controller. It came out at roughly the same time as the 360 controller too, so how did this one end up being so bizarre? Oh. If you want another infamous example, how about a Nyko wand controller for Wii? I've seen a ridiculous number of these out in the wild, and I think the only logical explanation is that everyone bought one just to see for themselves how truly garbage these things are. Plastic rattles when you shake it, and it has the lightest and cheapest feeling buttons that I've ever pressed. In fact, the whole controller feels that way, to the extent that clicking the inexplicably rubberized battery cover back into place will send shockwaves throughout the rest of the controller body. For a truly impressive combo, pair it with a Nyko nunchuck, and you too will discover just how much holding a controller can plummet your sense of self-worth. The only positive thing I have to say about this combo is that I like how the Z button has a little lip to keep your finger from sliding off. That is an oddly ergonomic touch. Back on the Sony side of things, I've also got this Hyperkin Brave Knight controller for PS3. Man, I wonder what copyright infringement they're narrowly avoiding with this one. For a quote-unquote premium controller, it feels oddly light, although the buttons and sticks are actually pretty solid. It's also a fair bit larger and way more angular than my DualShock 3, and I personally do not find it as comfortable to hold, though weirdly enough, it does feel way sturdier than the DualShock, which if anything just speaks to how unsturdy that controller feels. I wouldn't take this over OEM, but overall, it's not too bad. Now, since the 7th generation was when I got into home console gaming, my mental image of third-party controllers differs a bit from those who were older than me. So even though Mad Catz is the brand that typically comes to mind whenever gamers hear the words third-party controller or underwhelming, since I started gaming in this era, the manufacturer that I associate with those words is PDP, particularly due to two of their brands. First up is Rock Candy, whose gimmick has always been slightly garish translucent plastic that I more often than not associate with various Nintendo controllers, like this Wii Remote. Oh man, it's been so long since I've used one of these things, and I've gotta say, it's just as not great as I remember. The buttons feel way firmer and clickier than a standard remote, and the smaller ones up here are so flush with the controller that you can barely even feel that they're there. The plastic is way harder, but the controller is also way lighter. Wiimotes could do some serious damage to TVs, but they feel almost soft and elegant when compared to this thing. And oh yeah, why the hell did everything have to get moved around? We also have this matching Rock Candy nunchuck, and whew, I feel like I need to censor that, and by that I'm of course referring to this really shoddy looking wiring and not the absolute dump truck that the controller has come equipped with. But more so than Rock Candy, the brand that I think best represents this era of third-party controllers is Afterglow. because it just fits the vibe. Nothing pairs quite as nicely with nacho cheese Doritos, a 2-liter of Mountain Dew, and an evening of yelling racial slurs at a Modern Warfare 2 lobby than a red Afterglow controller for 360. Aside from the lights and the plastic used for the controller body, this is quite literally identical to the GameStop 360 controller. Makes sense, that was a PDP product too, which means that this controller is also surprisingly tolerable. Maybe not quite as finely tuned as the first party offerings, but still solid. I would happily use this controller if necessary. PDP definitely offers a mixed bag when it comes to controllers, but these are pretty alright. Speaking of Afterglow, here's a Chinese-made LED controller for Switch you can find on Amazon. The diagram on the back of the box is printed upside down. We're off to a great start. Unlike Afterglow, it has the interesting feature of flashing a light anytime you hit any input. I can only imagine that whoever designed it never tested this feature, because it would take the average person all of 5 seconds to realize that this is likely the worst possible way to implement lights into a gamepad. It's unbelievably distracting, and the last thing I need when I'm playing Luigi's Mansion is get flashbanged by my own controller. And with this, I think that's a good way to transition into the modern era of third-party controllers. We're in kind of a weird spot right now. A lot of the traditional third-party manufacturers like Mad Catz have either gone defunct or massively scaled back how much they're producing. For the brands that are left, there are a few standout examples, but for the most part, people are just buying these because they're cheap. The one brand I have the most recent experience with is PowerA, who made this Xbox One controller, and they never cease to amaze me. Who'd have thought quality materials could feel this bad? Rubberized plastic, accent lighting, back buttons, adjustable triggers, a proprietary braided micro USB cable that locks into place. This controller has a lot of nice features, but they all feel like they were cheaped out on. The triggers are particularly rough. There is a disturbing lack of resistance to them being pressed, and everything else on the controller just has a slight mushiness to it that I'm really not a fan of. Also, in my experience, a PowerA controller is about as reliable as your average Maserati, which is to say it dies after about 20 hours of use. I am not a fan of these things. For me, what defines the modern era of third-party controllers best is the massive flood of these generic, unbranded controllers that typically prey on people looking to get into retro gaming. I've owned a couple of these unbranded GameCube controllers for a while now, and yeah, they're kind of exactly what you would expect from a $5 GameCube controller. Thin, rattly, brittle, and probably would not pass the "can I snap this over my knee" test. It's inferior to the OEM controller in every conceivable way, but you know what? I'd still take it over this confused mess of plastic. I also have a couple for the Wii, but more interesting than the controller itself is the fact that there's a sticker for a cash converter on the back, meaning that this controller was at one point sold secondhand at a cashies in Australia or the UK or somewhere, somehow made its way stateside, and then got donated to the Goodwill where I got it from. How the heck did that happen? Returning to controllers for more recent consoles, here's a DualShock 4 knockoff produced by Computer Entertainment. Obviously. Actually, aside from the symbols for the face buttons, this looks and feels nearly identical to Sony's offerings. The triggers, the sticks, the bumpers, even the light bar, they've just about nailed everything. It's a very impressive copycat. Alright, just a few controllers left in the box. Let's see what we can round out this discussion with. Here's a Logitech Precision Gamepad for PC and Mac, which clearly takes inspiration from the original PS1 controller. The circle pad is kinda garbage, and it's a little weird how all the buttons are numbered, but for the most part, this is actually a nice controller. The construction is sturdy, the buttons are nice and clicky, and if the trigger guards were placed just a little bit further out, then I'd actually find it quite comfortable to hold. It's really nothing crazy, but that's what makes it a solid option for retro gaming on your computer. Keeping with the retro theme, here's an old school 6-button controller for Genesis. Now, I've never used an OEM 6-button controller, but I can't imagine that this one is too far off the mark. The form factor is there, and the buttons actually have a nice clickiness to them. For a modern retro controller, you could do far worse than this. Believe me, I would know. Another one of these unbranded controllers, this time for the NES. It certainly looks the part, all it's missing is the Nintendo logo, but does it feel right? Let's find out. Good God, these buttons are stiff. You have to use so much force to press these things down that they're almost painful to use, with the D-pad being especially atrocious. This thing desperately needs to see a chiropractor. Also, this controller port is for an Atari. PowerA returns, this time with a controller that's much more in line with what I'm used to expecting from them. The buttons are firm and clicky, and the triggers feel fine enough, but the controller itself is almost impossibly light, with the only explanation I can think of is that the engineers at PowerA somehow figured out how to fill this controller with concentrated void. Even the Xbox logo has vacated this controller, and honestly I can't blame it. I too would be embarrassed to be seen with this thing. Wait a second. How about this wireless controller? Also for Xbox One. This works better as a maraca. My word. I truly don't know how you'd come up with a cheaper feeling controller for Xbox One. This plastic is awful. The sticks have these weird ridges that are very tactically distracting, and I really don't care for them. The buttons are mushy, the bumpers are unnaturally springy, and the triggers feel like I'm pressing into a sponge cake. I can't possibly imagine paying more than $2 or $3 for this thing. Oh no. One last controller. Let's get this over with. This one is for the NES, and no, I can't think of a controller better suited for the description of future landfill material. It has 7 face buttons, just like any NES controller would. The buttons are rattly, it's lighter than air, and holding it makes me feel sad, but at least they got the controller port right. Well, we've survived the gauntlet, and I think the only valid conclusion here is that third-party controllers, they're just weird. On one hand, yes, a lot of them are cheap garbage that shouldn't elicit anything more than a "I guess if I have to" sort of reaction. Plenty more just flat out strange, or strike some combination of being both odd and bargain bin worthy. However, now that I've properly gone through the ones I have on hand, weirdly enough, I don't think you should be completely dismissive of them. There were some shockingly decent third-party controllers in this lot. And keep in mind, this is entirely stuff I got from some Goodwill. I didn't even bother buying any of the genuinely good third-party controllers out there. 8-Bit Do is a brand I followed for a while, and they're pretty well known for making some really solid controllers and accessories. There's the Hori Split Pad for Switch, which is another I've had the chance to use before, and it is quite comfortable. The Thrustmaster eSwap is a much more bespoke option designed to compete with most elite controllers, and in the grand scheme of things, brands like Logitech and Hyperkin really aren't that bad. A lot of what they've made are totally acceptable. I think a third-party controller is best when it really strikes that balance of being a little bit cheaper than OEM while still offering a well-constructed and ergonomic experience. There are plenty that are like that, and even though that mental image is rarely what's conjured when someone speaks the words third-party controller, I think there are enough out there to give third-party controllers some margin of credibility. Well, that was a long and marginally traumatizing experience. I guess if anything, I've learned to be a bit more open-minded to third-party controllers. However, that does not apply to this thing. I've tried to understand it, but it is stupid and dumb and makes no sense. Just like ending a video by cutting yourself off mid-sentence.
Dray, are you playing with your controllers again?
Yes?
Just keep it down.
Okay.